All right, so next I want to draw on kind of the distinctions between macro and microeconomics. And I've, kind of talked at length at this point about kind of macro and micro, and kind of touching on that, but I've never really formally defined them, which, is important. You want to know which class you're taking. Are you taking the class that's going to look at government and GDP and unemployment and inflation, or you want to take a look at the class that looks at like how pricing and how individual markets react and quantity supplied and demanded on a more individual level. So first bullet point, there are two major branches of economics. You have microeconomics and macroeconomics. Micro is the Greek word for small. Macro is the Greek word for big. You might see like a microscope, right? Something you can look at with your, so you can see tiny things. Consider microeconomics to be the microscope of economics. We're looking at individual businesses. We're looking at, individual households, anything that's kind of where the scope seems more or less limited to individuals and kind of narrow picture economics. On the other hand, you have macro, which means big, macroeconomics, which is, bigger picture economics. How does the government increase overall production? How do governments control for the whole economy's household spending, that kind of thing? How do large swaths of people budget, that kind of thing? Bigger picture kind of questions. Macro means big. There's like micro and macro fauna. Microfauna, fauna means animal. So microfauna is like, your tiny animals. Macrofauna are your dinosaurs. Micronutrients are your vitamins and your minerals. Macronutrients are the big picture nutrients that you want to eat: carbs, protein, fat. Okay? Macro big, micro small. Macro, large picture stuff, aggregated across economies. A lot of households, a lot of economies, a lot of governments. Micro can still focus on government, but it'll usually look at one individual government or two governments competing with each other, versus like how governments as a whole will tackle a problem. Micro typically restrains itself to, one kind of smaller question, whereas macro will be larger picture questions and things in aggregate, which just means like things as a whole. Okay. And, the two will interplay. Oftentimes, bigger picture macro models will be generated first in micro. So we'll look at things, or microeconomists will look at things where, how two firms compete, and they might say something about how, pricing strategy in this particular case leads to like longer working hours or something like that. Macro will then take it and they'll apply it on the household level, but then they'll start with the household level, and then they'll use that representative household that I talked about in the last couple slides to kind of say something broader about the general economy, whereas micro will just focus on like an individual or an individual business. Okay. So like I said, micro tends to look at individual pieces of an economy, whereas so questions like, if I add a bonus, are my workers more productive? Right. So if you incentivize like production, like if you say like if you have 30 sales this year, you're gonna see a bonus. You might have workers who want to then reach the 30 sales goal, right? So they might be more productive in the sense of 30, like trying to reach that 30 target. But they also might have sold 35, and then once they reach their 30 target and they get their bonus, they might stop. That would be like a microeconomics question. If I add a bonus, are my workers more productive? What happens if Uber competes with taxi companies? Again, this is looking at one particular industry and two particular companies, or two or three major companies like taxi companies. I don't really know what the taxi company is called. It's usually like one specific company is real big in one particular area. And then Uber, which is kind of like a more globalized taxi company. But once Uber enters into the market, how does that affect taxi pricing? How does that affect quantity supplied for taxis? How does that affect equilibrium quantity of overall ride shares and overall, ridership between both on the whole? Again, one industry, a few companies. How are they competing in a kind of a more in a way that you can kind of look at it in a more focused way? Okay. How will trade in China affect manufacturing jobs in places like Ohio? So this is kind of similar to the last question. I added in it's a whole country now, but really you're looking at one industry in one place, and then you have one influencer, not like an Instagram influencer, but one variable that will influence manufacturing jobs in that particular place. So given that China is exporting more to the United States, and let's say Ohio is big into steel, maybe steel production is decreasing, right? But it's still one industry, steel and manufacturing, and in one place, Ohio, which is a part of the United States, versus looking at overall global trade patterns as a result of increasing GDP in China. And also that, depending on how you phrase the question, that might still be a micro question because you're looking at one country, but it might also be a macro question. It kind of depends. But the way that this particular question is phrased, it's 100% a micro question. You're looking at one industry and one variable, which would be jobs as it relates to trade. Okay, macro has a much broader scope. How do interest rates affect national unemployment? In this case, you're not just talking about United States national unemployment. You're talking about national unemployment in the United States, in Estonia, in Latvia, in Saudi Arabia, right? You're looking at interest rates as a topic and how they affect, global unemployment in particular nations, right? So even though you might be focused on one nation in your data set, the idea is that you're going to apply it to like all nations, right? This would be more of a macro topic in that you're kind of covering a lot of different countries here. Like even if you're looking at the United States, you're expecting it to be a valid question to apply to Latvia or Saudi Arabia, right? So it's a bigger picture question, and it's not really focused on one particular industry. You're looking at interest rates. That might be mortgage interest rates. It might be interest rates that are touching between banks, right? Which will then have trickle down effects. I shouldn't use the word trickle down because that kind of means something particular. But it'll have repercussions between banks that, like the interbank ratio, will have effects on how the stock market's doing. It'll have effects on how the bond market's doing. It'll have effects on how your personal savings rate is doing, right? It's not just like one particular industry. You're talking banking, you're talking housing, you're talking finance, you're talking everything that's touched by finance. So that could be technology, that could be the service industry. It's a huge kind of scope of question, right? So interest rates will be like more of a broad indicator that'll touch a lot of different industries, whereas before trade as it affects Chinese trade as it affects manufacturing jobs in Ohio is one industry, one topic. This is broad industry, and it is affecting unemployment in banking, in tech, in the service sector, in academics, right? A broad question, and it can apply from the United States all the way to Japan, you know. So in that sense, it's a macro question. It's a very broad question that you're asking right there. Another example of a macro question: why do some countries grow faster than others? Again, you know, you might be looking at like for your particular data set might be on, you know, the United States, but you probably, like if you're looking at why it grows faster than others, you're probably comparing it to like China, and you're probably comparing it to Europe, right? So you're already, in that sense, you already have a lot of data right there across multiple countries, and you're looking at broad output. Again, that's many industries. Broad output is the sum of all industries, essentially. So it's a really big question, and it's kind of really hard to answer. So when you have these macro level questions, you kind of bring in more abstraction necessarily, whereas micro level questions, you know, if you're looking at trade in China, yeah, you're gonna be making some assumptions. You're gonna be making an abstraction about, you know, how trade affects, you know, certain industries more than others, and you might be making assumptions about, you know, how imports are calculated, or this or that. But the assumptions aren't nearly to the level of calculating overall global output and comparing it between countries and making assumptions based on that, because there's a million things you could possibly control for when you're looking at global output, whereas, you know, there's still a lot of things you can control for manufacturing output, but it's you know, way more focused. So micro, to recap, micro focuses on individual, firms, and households. So if I ever ask you how does an individual behave, if I ever ask you how one or two firms behave, how a particular industry behaves, how a particular household behaves, those are all micro questions. How do I, as George Pinnell, how do I budget? How do I, as George Pinnell, your professor, how do I assign grades? That's a micro question. If I give everybody 80s regardless of effort, or regardless of grade, like regardless of, you know, what your raw grade would be, that's an economics question in the sense of like that'll affect your behavior, your outcome, and I'm going to want to subject my objective, which is to, you know, teach you the most, subject to some fairness constraint and some time constraint, right? That's a micro question. Me as the grader making kind of assumptions about, you know, how you guys behave, but by and large, you know, it's kind of a targeted question. Macroeconomics would be like, why do professors across nations grade differently? That'd be more of a macro question, even though that's still kind of in one industry. But, you know, for the sake of giving an analogous example, it's a much bigger question. But macro kind of focuses on the economy as a whole, or in aggregate. Same way of saying the different things, or different way of saying the same thing. So you're looking at national output and global output across tech, across services, across the oil sector, across you know, the banking sector. How is that affected by one particular variable or multiple variables, and how is that different across countries, right? You're taking what could be one household, maybe in your mathematical model, it starts as one household, but then you're abstracting it to a much bigger level using aggregation, where the household will stand in for the global economy or the national economy as it relates to certain variables. Okay.